There, everybody. Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you like and subscribe to the channel. This is called Solitary Confinement Nightmare. And let me explain a little before I read something to you. Uh, I may not have the excitement telling this story that I have with some of my others because this was a very emotional uh, time for me. It is something that impacted me mentally and emotionally for the rest of my life. I had been exposed to solitary confinement when I was in Mid Hudson Psychiatric Hospital. There were many times that I was placed in a padded room, but most of those times I was heavily medicated when they would put me in those rooms. And I was also younger when those things transpired. So I guess I was a little tougher mentally and emotionally. And it was torture at that time, but somehow I had gotten through it. But the fact that I was put in a padded room and in a solitary room countless times over 3 years, sometimes for a month at a time, sometimes for 3 months at a time, the fact that I had lived through that had definitely caused some damage inside of me. So when I was taken out of the institution and put back into the prison system, being exposed to solitary confinement was something that for me became unbearable. What people don't understand about me is that I was a very hyper individual. Um, one of my nicknames as a kid was Home Toast. They used to call my brother Home Peace because he was very peaceful inside of his room, reading and writing. And they called me Home Toast because I popped in and out of the house 100 times a day, like a piece of toast popping up and down. And so one of my mother's boyfriends called me Home Toast. I was extremely hyper. I boxed, I wrestled, I played basketball, I played baseball, I ran track. I was just a very hyper individual who never sat still. And even when I was in prison, it was kind of the same way. I would be in the prison cell waiting for the door to open. I would go to every recreational period. I would go to rec in the morning, go to rec in the afternoon, go to rec at the night, play handball all 3 times, lift weights, keep myself busy, burn myself out because of how hyper I am. And then so to take somebody like, and I also had mental health issues. So to take somebody like that and then throw them in solitary confinement was true torture. So I've written a couple of things that I'm going to read to you, and then I'll get back to explaining. In this incident, I had ended up hitting someone when I was in Mid Orange Correctional Facility. A 20-year-old kid with a really slick mouth was kind of backing me into a corner, and I ended up knocking him out. And so I'll get into some of that story, but let me first read something I wrote to you. Solitary confinement. Has serving 15 years and 8 months in prison so far caused some sense of mental illness inside of me? I ask this logical question due to the fact on a normal, uneventful day inside of prison, I remain scared, abnormally scared to be subjected to solitary confinement. Last night was another endless nightmare that I laid in bed, in the dark, crying, shaking, my heart beating, because I fear being sent to solitary again. It's much more than being claustrophobic. I panic at the thought of it. I can honestly say that if I am ever faced with solitary again, I will take my own physical life rather than experience the mental and emotional pain that goes spirit and soul deep. In the 15 years I have been incarcerated so far, I have only been sent to solitary 2 times. Once for throwing a single punch when some 20-year-old kid serving 1 to 3 years backed me into a corner. Once I was taken into solitary room, my heart started beating. I became dizzy. I started to sweat, panic, and my breathing became erratic. I started pacing. It became impossible to sit still. I sat on the bed for 1 second, then stood up, sat down, stood up, over and over. I was going deeper and deeper into an intense psychotic state. I tried to meditate. I tried to pray. I tried breathing exercises, physical exercise. Nothing worked. I ended up curled up in fetal position in the corner, my skin turning pale from pure fright. I started screaming for help. I was afraid to scream because I feared the officers would just see me as being a pain in the ass and hurt me. I had no choice. I felt as if I was seconds away from dying of a heart attack. The officer arrived. He was the opposite of my fear. He talked to me, said he would get me help. I was grateful he realized my need. But when he left, I started to panic again. After several hours, I started to debate suicide just to relieve the crushing pain. I kept mentally telling myself that I could handle it, that there was no monster under the bed that could hurt me, and there was no need to be afraid. But nothing worked. I actually wanted to beat the circumstances. I attempted to accept it as a challenge. It was fruitless. I started to talk to myself. I started to say goodbye to family and friends. I don't know how I made it through the night. I cried harder than ever in my life. I was up before the sun, panicking, pacing, crying, then screaming again. A man from the mental health department came to see me. When they took me out of the room to meet with me, I felt somewhat better and more relaxed. When they placed me back in the room, I just couldn't do it. There was no way I could help you decipher this panic and pain. I screamed so loud. The injury on my hand from the punch I threw became severely infected, and I was removed from solitary and taken to the outside hospital. I underwent 2 surgeries and spent a total of 33 days in the hospital. This entire incident was approximately 1.5 years ago. I have lived every day since worried, afraid, scared of the possibility I may be one day sent back to solitary confinement. I have made up my mind. I will take my life before that ever happens. Solitary confinement for me is something I just can't explain, nor something I can mentally or emotionally handle. The experience took a part of me forever. It was not punishment for me. It was torture. That was one small story that I wrote. And let me continue it from midway of another story. I arrived at 11 p.m. The van parked by the door of the solitary unit, and 2 officers greeted me as I stepped in. Their welcome speech began. This is Ulster Box. When we speak to you, listen to everything we say. If you make one wrong move, we will fuck you up bad. If you answer back, we will fuck you up bad. If you cause any problems, we will fuck you up bad. Just do what you're told and keep your mouth shut. I understand these officers do this to establish the fact that they are in charge, but I must say in all honesty, they were 2 little punks who could never handle me if I decided to get upset. This was not a case of the officers establishing the fact that they were in charge. It was a clear case of power going to their head, of abusing another human being because they were in a uniform and I was just another prisoner. A waste of life in their eyes. It has always bothered me when officers speak to me like that, because I'm a man who never warrants it. I give everyone a tremendous amount of courtesy, regardless if I was in a position over them or under them. I was taken to a small room that stunk of old sweat and told to face the wall. The handcuffs and restraints were removed, and I was told to press my face against the mat which hung there. The mat is hung against the wall for one reason. So when the officers smash your face against the wall, you don't sustain bruises that can be photographed. I was told to strip, with the officers doing their best to confuse me. Without taking your face off the wall, take your left hand and take off your right boot, then hand it back on your left. Now take your right hand and take off your left boot, handing it back on the right. Once down to my underwear, I was handed a dirty set of old clothes 2 sizes too small and told to get dressed. I had to accomplish all this with a stitched up and swollen hand. I was handcuffed again, and the officer said, "We are now taking you to the box. When you walk, drag your right shoulder against the right wall. If your shoulder comes off the wall, we will fuck you up. Walk." Several electric gates opened, and as we walked, controlled by an officer in a bulletproof rotunda. We stopped in front of the door that opened electronically, and before stepping in was told, "There is no talking in this box, so don't utter a word. Step in." I stepped into the brightest room I ever saw, and the door shut behind me. Once the door closed, a small slot in the door opened, and I was told to back up against the door and stick my handcuffed hands out of the slot so I could be uncuffed. With a freshly stitched up wound that was bone deep, I had to get on my toes, squeeze my hands through this tiny slot, and as the officers forced my hands through, the pain was tremendous. They took the cuffs off and closed the slot. There was total silence. The hole I entered was 8 foot by 10 foot. The floor hard gray cement with food stains, and stains that remain unknown. The walls were solid cement and stained with dried food, blood, snot, you name it. The stainless steel toilet with a tiny sink attached was built into the wall and disgusting. The steel bed was attached to the wall with a mattress so thin it could be considered a mat. The room was freezing. There was a window in the back of the room that couldn't be opened or closed by me, but controlled by the officers. The window itself is covered with old steel bars and wire mesh. What's in the room is required by law to be there. A blanket so thin you could see through it, 2 old sheets, 1 stained pillowcase, a tiny hotel-sized bar of soap, a tiny toothbrush 2 inches long, 1 roll of toilet paper, and a tiny tube of toothpaste. That's it. I was so cold I wrapped the blankets and sheets around me and sat on the bed, under the brightest light that remains on 24 hours a day. What happened next is what really inspired me to write this story. Within an hour, I started to panic. I started suffering deep and severe panic and anxiety attacks, and my heart started to viciously pound so hard I felt that I was about to have a heart attack. I visibly began to sweat and shake, and regardless of how hard I attempted, I couldn't calm myself. I found myself pacing in this small cage like an animal, back and forth, started crying so intensely I could see the tears hitting the dirty floor. I tried to sit down and within seconds jumped back to my feet. I tried to pray, got on my knees, but panic and anxiety were overcovering me quickly. My heart was exploding. I wanted to scream for help, but feared the officers would react violently. I started to talk to God, out loud, asking Him to help me, telling Him I was sorry. I kept trying to calm myself, telling myself that I could handle this, that I was strong enough to get through this. But my thoughts and positive thinking weren't working. I know yoga, know how to meditate, but my mental and emotional state would not permit me to use these methods of relaxation. I tried over and over again, but to no avail. My description right now of how intense my pain was is actually no description at all. There are no words that can help you decipher or comprehend this feeling. Trapped in a freezing, bright, dirty room all alone. Pain so strong in the spirit and soul, you just beg God to end your life. After 3 hours, I couldn't take another second, and I started pounding on the door and screaming for help. When the officer arrived, I was lucky. He was someone who was willing to listen. He was actually a nice guy. I explained what I was going through mentally and emotionally. I could tell he realized I was serious. As an officer, he is used to prisoners acting, doing whatever they can to get out of solitary. He sees prisoners who are just looking for attention. But in my case, I believe he realized this was no act. He told me he would be back shortly. About 2 a.m., he returned with the sergeant, who was also pretty decent. I explained my mental state and told him there was nothing he can do. He told me there was nothing he can do this time of night. He stood at the door and spoke to me for about 10 minutes. Usually unheard of, from what I understand. He asked me what he could do for me. I asked him for a Bible. He returned several minutes later with the King James Bible, novels, and a few magazines, then told me he would have someone from the mental health department see me in the morning. I laid in bed and read different parts of the Bible. I felt somewhat better and finally fell asleep, thinking of my life and crying. I hysterically jumped up sometime very early in the morning. There is no way to tell time in solitary, except by the times they slide our meals through a hole in the door. When I awoke, I was in a panic. the anxiety taking over my body physically, and my heart was beating completely out of control. I was shaking so much I couldn't stand. I felt every injury on my body that I ever had. I just couldn't stop crying. The officers are required by law to check the solitary room several times an hour so they can see if anybody took their own life or happened to be laying on the floor suffering something like a heart attack. This means that even if they don't actually check, which the majority do not, they do walk by the room. They also walk by each morning and offer very limited supplies. In order to get these supplies, the prisoner must stand on the door waiting. If not, the officer will just speed walk right past. The supplies offered are 5 sheets of writing paper, a small flexible pen, and envelopes. Once a week, the officer will bring a library cart with some old novels and magazines. If you want toilet paper or toothpaste, you must hand them the finished roll or the finished tube. We are permitted 3 10-minute showers a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. According to law, a prisoner is also entitled to 60 minutes of outdoor recreation a day. This recreation consists of being handcuffed and escorted into an 8 by 10 cage referred to as the dog cage. All you can do is pace in this small cage, which is designed exactly like the dog runs you see at a kennel, except smaller. With no jacket or sweatshirt, this was out of the question. Being closed in the cage was out of the question as well for me. I started to think that maybe it would be better for me to die than be trapped in this room. I was beginning to give this serious thought. My pulse and heart were beating so hard, I just knew I was going to have a heart attack. I started to panic. I started to think of saying goodbye to my family and friends and started to think of times and people that I would miss. I was thinking of ways to end my life. I found myself staring at the ceiling, looking to see if there was a place I would be able to hang myself if necessary. I couldn't calm myself. As strong as I was physically, as much as I have survived in life, this was becoming too much for me. I couldn't eat for several days now. I was losing weight. I went to the corner of the room, sat on the floor, curled up in a ball, cried, shook, just wanting to die. I was losing my mind. I started talking to myself, and I worried that this experience, if I survived, would permanently take something away from me mentally forever. Sometime in the afternoon, the officers came into the room, and they had me stick my hands through the slot. They handcuffed me, then escorted me to a small room where Mr. Greenberg from the mental health department was waiting for me. We sat across a small table. With no offense, his aura was one of the typical state worker. He looked upset with being bothered so early in the day. He didn't want to be there. He looked at me and said, "What's the problem?" We spoke for about 15 minutes. I went through everything. We went over parts of my mental health history. Then he handed me some paper which explained in children's terms how to breathe properly, how to meditate. It was nonsense. I told him there was no way I could live in that room. He asked me if I was suicidal. I lied. I told him no. I knew if I said yes, my circumstances would get worse. They would strip me naked and place me in a room with no blanket, no sheets, hand me a paper gown to wear, and leave me in what is called an observation cell. I knew if I was placed in that situation, things would only begin to get even more painful for me. This man from mental health didn't do his job. Here I was, a complete basket case, crying, shaking, explaining to him that I was just hanging on, that I'm suffering from panic and anxiety attacks, that I have suffered from bipolar depression with hyperactivity disorder in my past. Yet he told me to try breathing and sent me back into the room. I was literally seconds away from taking my own life. My panic and anxiety that powerful. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that during all this time, the wound in my hand was getting worse. I believe my mental and emotional breakdown was stopping me from healing physically. Also, the doctor who sewed me up made a drastic mistake. Hospital protocol is that you do not stitch a closed wound from someone's mouth. Because the doctor did close this wound, any infection was now trapped inside of my body. My hand was blowing up. It turned bright pink and hot and was slowly moving up my arm. When the officer came by, I stopped him and showed him my hand. He called a nurse who took one look and said, "We need to get this man to an outside hospital right now." I was shackled, cuffed, chained, then driven to a medical center. I thanked God for this infection because it had now gotten me out of solitary. The moment I was taken out of solitary, my panic and anxiety would subside. But although these feelings subsided, physically I was feeling the damage. Mentally and emotionally, I was feeling the damage. And I started living with the fear of being placed back in the room again. When we arrived at the hospital, people of course were staring because I was chained up like an animal. I went through the intake process, then was taken into a room where I was finally being treated like a normal human being. The nurse entered the room and unwrapped my hand. He then called a doctor who ordered me hooked to an IV of antibiotics, told me that I was being admitted, then asked me what I needed. I told them I was starving. I never mentioned that they basically feed us nothing in solitary, just cold food that couldn't fill a child. Everyone loses weight in the box. The doctor brought me some hot food and beverages. We went through all the routine questions, and they just couldn't figure out why the previous doctor had sewn up my hand. I was taken to a hospital prison ward. By this time, it was about midnight. That's all I can read of this story right now. Solitary was a nightmare, and it's something I'll never forget. It's over 15 years later, and it stays with me today. Do I think solitary is necessary? I think it's torture. At the same time, let's say you have a prisoner running around stabbing people in the general population. What do you do with them? But their form of solitary was insane. Being locked in that little room with the lights on, freezing, night after night, I was losing my mind. I was losing my mind. There's much more to that story about what happened when I got to the hospital. Maybe I'll tell it another time. Solitary was a nightmare for a person who was hyper. I never forget just sitting on that steel bed all alone. I didn't think I was going to make it out of there alive. I'm surprised I did. That was all because I threw one punch at someone. A 20-year-old kid who was backing me into a corner with a big mouth, and I decided to give him a shot. It was, I don't know what to say. It was torture. Solitary is a scary place when you're trapped alone. I came across guys that didn't mind it. They didn't care being alone. There were guys that would go to solitary on purpose. They felt safer away from the population. For me, it was a nightmare. I think it was because of the trauma that I experienced in the mental institutions. I thought I was going to die in there alone, in a cold room, staring at the dirty walls. All my family on the street, not knowing the situation I was in. It was a real fucked up experience to be trapped in that room. And you think of your old friends that are out there in the world on the street with their family, with their children, living life. And you're just stuck in this cold, miserable, mean place with no way out. The abusive officers. It was really tough, man. Solitary is really tough.